a good afternoon and very warm welcome to the Balie on the last day of our Forum on European Culture. In the past 4 days we had a full program in and around the Balie with important thinkers, writers, artists from all over Europe to discuss the meaning of the future, I would say, of democracy in our continent. We discussed this under the motto, A Culture of Democracy. And the program you are attending now, What History Tells Us About Pandemics, is part of that as well. Well, my name is Juri Albrecht, I'm the director of the Balie, and this afternoon it's my great pleasure, really great pleasure, to meet and introduce to you one of our most renowned historians, Simon Schama, or maybe I should say Sir Simon. Because in 2018 he was knighted by the Queen Elizabeth for his exceptional contribution to history.
Left my horse outside.
Yeah. So please don't frighten the horses. Professor Schama taught history at Cambridge, Oxford and Harvard, writes for almost 30 years now for The New Yorker and is widely acclaimed for his vivid and engaging storytelling. In his many books and many documentaries, he has especially written a lot about art history, of course, Jewish history, French history, British history, and Dutch history. A lot. The Embarrassment of Riches has been a bestseller in our country. Overvloed en Onbehagen, I presume many of you have read it, 1987. The Golden Age, but actually I think the first book you've written, because there's an impressive list in the new book, most of it is about Dutchmen, actually. Patriots and Liberators, Revolutions in the Netherlands.
Right.
So, give him a very warm applause, Professor Simon Schama. You are a very regular visitor to the Netherlands. You read Dutch, of course, but you speak it as well.
Een kleine beetje, ja.
Ja.
Ik kan Hollands praten, maar vandaag misschien nee.
Well, today we'll be talking about foreign bodies, pandemics, vaccines, and the health of nations. But why did you? I mean, first I thought when I first started reading you that you probably were Dutch originally.
Fries, usually,
Yeah.
and Minister Schama in Leeuwarden, they treat me like family, really. And I try to explain that my grandfather was actually came from Bocan in Romania, Moldova, Romania, and his father came from Izmir in Turkey. So it's a sort of mixed up. We called ourselves Sephardi trash, the Shamas. Plenty Ashkenazi marriages in Romania, as happened. Terrible arguments on Passover evening whether the charoset should be cooked, yes or not. But it goes back to, it's a good question, I've often asked it myself, and I realize, sometimes without knowing it, we're the product of, inevitably, childhood impressions. And I mean, the first time I came to Holland was on, my father, particularly my father, was very keen, we're in the early 1950s now, in getting away from London, which was still very burnt out London when I was growing up.
Still some fog around.
Pardon?
And then there was still fog.
There was very much fog. I love the fog. I can still, I think as you get older, as you will find, young Yuri, when you get older, the kind of Proustian side, which appears in the book, of sensations becomes very vivid. You remember more and more. On any given day, I have no idea where my car keys are at all, but I remember the smell of the fog. In fact, the smell of the fog as it came through my school scarf, really, which I'm unreasonably nostalgic about. But when my father was doing well, which was not often, we made it to Nice. When my father was not doing so well, it was Knokkerlezoet. It was a sort of Jewish place. Scheveningen was. It was a kind of Jewish holiday place. And it rained a lot. And on one particular rainy day, we drove over the border. And this is going to surprise everybody. I remember the first Dutch place almost, and you'll correct me, but it seems to me was Sluis. Right. And I actually, my friend Gary is here, and I think, to me, I remembered everything was so calm and still. And Gary said, well, it's a kind of slum full of pawn shops now, really. I think you said, actually, anybody here from Sluis? I'm sure it's been cleaned up, now. But it was a sort of vision I had in my head of you know, kind of, I mean, a sort of child's parody version of Vermeer or, you know, Essayas van der Velde Zierikzee, the kind of sense of something quiet and undisturbed by the wreckage of war. It's kind of illusion. So, you know, I put that away, really. And then there was a lot of, inevitably, you know, as all of the children of my generation, and Frank loomed very, very large, necessarily. But then I was really, you know, what really excited me when I was an undergraduate was the French Revolution, and I was really a French historian before I was anything else. But I also knew I wanted to work, when I started to do graduate work, on how the French conducted themselves, what became of the revolution when it became a military power and then expanded, in the euphemism, really basically invaded and occupied neighboring countries in the name of liberation, which in the beginning was not disingenuous because, you know, the French Republic had been set on by the coalition absolutist powers, Prussia, Austria, and eventually Britain and Spain. So it wasn't, but it very quickly degenerated into a kind of French empire, basically, even way before Napoleon. So I wanted to see what happened to the corruption of the revolutionary ideal. We are freeing you from feudalism. And it was sort of, you know, I remember a good friend of mine called Paul Ginsburg, who became, some of you may have read him, the great historian of post-20th century Italy. Paul and I were very good friends in Cambridge, and we were talking about, he also wanted to do something about liberalism and the 19th century, and we thought, well, he chose to work on Venice, and I thought, no, I really want to work on the Netherlands because they have their own powerfully distinctive sense of what Hollandse vrijheid, you know, meant something totally different from the French Revolutionary version. I thought about this a lot when I was in the Algemene Rijksarchief in July, and it was still raining, and I thought of Paul sitting in the Venetian sunshine, and I thought, why did I do that? But I'm very, very glad I did, because the more I came to understand the Dutch Republic, particularly in the 18th eeuw, where very few people were working, you know, and on the Bataafse tijd, on the very end, you know, it was me and 3 other people, really. The more I understood what Voltaire and Diderot meant when they described the Dutch Republic as enigmatic, as mystery, with a kind of, you know, a veneer of functional economics and trading and commerce and banking and all of that. And all of that was real. But beneath it, what was really enigmatic and mysterious were the bonds which tied people together in local communities, in towns like Haarlem or Gouda and so on, which, so that's this sort of sense of the improbability of survival, really, you know, was extremely powerful to me, and I came at it all the way around. I mean, I still went into that first book thinking it was going to be a book about France, and then when I was in the Archives Nationales in Paris, I realized, I describe it in the preface to Patriots and Liberators as looking at a subject through the wrong end of a telescope, that the story about the smaller country disintegrating was a kind of profound tragedy, really, especially since the rhetoric of the time was all about rejuvenation, you know, and this was the big subject. And the big power, what the French writing to each other, just trying to get their hands on Dutch money, of which there was none left by the time, you know, they'd finished with indemnities. The story of the big power, all you had to look at, you know, Brezhnev's Soviet Union, and you realized it was sort of predictably banal. It was the way big states behave when they want to lie to themselves and everybody else. Hello, Vladimir Putin. And it was sort of less interesting to me. And then actually, when I remember sitting with Bitterballen, we had a long discussion of Bitterballen. I know you all really have come to hear that, but I was sitting poking Bitterballen in the postern cafe in Denmark when I heard of the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And I'd been to Czechoslovakia in 1965, and many of my friends who were starting to say indiscreet things then went to prison, or one of them was beaten up and was very ill. So the sort of sense of wiring between history then and history now. We were taught in the 1960s that you should never do that, that actually history exists in discrete packages, and you can basically, you can compromise the true alien quality, the remoteness, the unreachable quality of history, if you simply project your own troubles back into the past. I never quite, and it was called presentism. Presentism was the sin of saying what's wrong and let's hunt in the past. Rather like the title you gave this session, what can we learn from, etc. Perfectly fine. But I never quite believed that. Not least I thought, well, history in a Western tradition begins with Thucydides. I'm not presuming to kiss the hem of his, whatever the Greek robe was. But Thucydides is a protagonist in the epic drama he is writing about, the Peloponnesian in the Peloponnesian Wars. So, and he structures the whole thing around a tragedy. So he's a general in the war who is fired for leading an unsuccessful campaign. So he takes that personal experience and that history as indeed a seminar about the right public life. And as you all know, lets each side battle it out verbally as well as militarily in it. So I've always been torn between wanting to preserve the distinctness of these, the foreign country that is the past, and knowing that it very often ought to be wired to our own concerns. I mean, a historian called Herbert Butterfield said, I'm pretty sure it's Butterfield, said, all history is a kind of negotiation between familiarity and remoteness. And he said, therein lies its poetry, which is actually a very nice way to put it. So.
Thank you for also explaining your vision on what history is, and not only why you were interested in the Dutch. But yes, there's a slight sort of... Yeah, that might be better.
Don't chop my ear off. Really, only Van Gogh.
You might need it still, yeah. Because I thought, looking at the list of publications, which is very impressively long, and I realized that I had read about half of them, but not so many. But it's
only half. Well, I'm leaving in that case,
And to be honest, but there's a lot of Rembrandt and Vermeer and Holland. But I thought. I thought, might it be the case that you sort of tried your hand first on this small republic on the other side of the North Sea, and then really delved into the real thing, which is History of Britain, Volume 1, 2, and 3?
No, it's interesting you say that, Yuri, because actually there are, again, I think, to simplify tremendously, there are two kinds of psychologies of historical research. One is to dwell within what's roughly speaking your own culture, and investigate, or really to go to work on people who are extremely not like you, who are actually. And one of the sad things, I know to be the case in Britain, I don't know if it's the case in Holland, it's certainly the case in America. When we were at school again, and again it was because of the war, and the thrill of being able to get on a train and go very far away, travel by night, stand in the corridor of trains, rumbling to Rome or wherever. We were all very excited about learning foreign languages and doing European history, and sometimes when I was an undergraduate, I did a lot of Indian history, which first makes its appearance here. So the sense of wanting to put yourself in the shoes of people really who don't come from your background and your tradition. So I've kind of done both. When I did British history and then when I did Jewish history, of course, these were all returns to thinking about the culture that I was part of. Mm-hmm. But the beginning, history was always a foreign adventure, really. It was sort of sense of wanting to find a way into an incommensurably different experience of place. Place always mattered, the relationship between place and culture. That is obviously at the heart of Overvloed Non-Behagen, but it's actually at the heart of pretty much everything I've written, I think, actually.
But let's go to the book, your new book. It's just out in Dutch as well. In Dutch is called In gezonde staat. Hoe pandemieën en vaccins de geschiedenis hebben bepaald. In English, it's called Foreign Bodies, Pandemics, Vaccines and the Health of Nations. I think the title is amazingly concise in English. It's exciting because foreign bodies, we just, over the past corona years, we realized that injecting foreign bodies in our body is, something which might be important, and but it's counterintuitive, as you say in the book.
Yeah.
But also foreign bodies, there might be foreign agents, foreign secret agents, but also foreign parts in the body of the populace.
Right.
The foreign bodies which are might be immigrants, might be blacks, might be Jewish. Over the past few hundred years, it normally were the Jews who hold the foreign bodies. So I mean, the title is chilling in many ways, and very concise. It is a very good read. And
funny, I don't think of it as chilling. And many people have said that. And I totally see what you mean. And indeed, it was meant to have this sense of people imagining vaccination as a kind of conspiracy, a threat.
Well, also,
Bill Gates really developing, or George Soros being behind vaccines so that he can insert microchips into your body.
Yeah, and follow you.
It's extraordinary. That kind of primitive trope really still flourishes more than ever now. But of course, actually, the book in a way is a kind of hymn to the virtues of cosmopolitanism, actually, and all of my heroes in here are all some of the major figures, not just Hafkeen, who we might talk about, who's at the heart of the book, but also some of the early people who were first responsible for smallpox inoculation, getting accepted as a way to avoid dying from smallpox, were people, as I said, they were in the early 1700s. People who were literally interpreters as well as physicians, were diplomats, sometimes from European states, sometimes from within the Ottoman Empire. They were the first people to really report that inoculation, if you actually took a little bit of pus of poison matter from an infected body and stuck it subcutaneously under your skin, you'd either escape smallpox altogether, or if usually you would not escape it altogether. The idea was to have a very mild form of smallpox, which would give you a slight fever, and the scabs would simply drop off and leave you not disfigured. Shall we have a look at... where's Caroline? So can we have a look at... it's a good... Mary Wortley Montague, in her Turkish dress. We'll come back to this man who matters a lot to me. So if we can get it, are you having clicker troubles? Okay, there we go.
She is.
Yeah, there we go. It's a lovely painting by an English artist a society artist called Godfrey Kneller. So she was extraordinary. Shall I say a bit about her then? Yeah, can I talk about her a bit? So she's in Turkish dress. This was painted around, I think, 1718, 1720. So absolutely around the time. She's the first person in English society, really, to inoculate her small son. She did it in Constantinople. She's the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and who's called Edward Wortley Montague. She was famous before she went with her husband to Constantinople for many reasons. She was a published poet, quite a good one, actually, one of the very earliest women to have her literary work published. Aphra Behn was a playwright who, probably the most famous one earlier, but she became, as a result of her published poetry, a friend of very important figures in the English literary world. Alexander Pope, who was in love with her, and Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe and so on, all of the mighty warriors of the pen, the editors of The Spectator. So she was a celebrity, and she'd had two things that really were traumatically formative for her. Her older brother, also called Edward, had died of smallpox, a few years before, 1715, 3 years before she went to Constantinople. And she herself had suffered a horrific attack of smallpox, which very nearly killed her. And she'd been a famous beauty, and the smallpox left her very disfigured, which the artist, of course, decides to cosmetically ignore. She'd lost her eyelashes famously, and so she was very wounded by this. And when she went to the Ottoman Empire with her husband, she writes this up very beautifully and elegantly in letters to a friend of hers, Sarah Chisel, and later in what were called the Turkish Diaries, published much later, that she'd noticed that the women of the seraglios of the pashas, the aristocracy of the empire, and indeed of the sultan and the grand vizier, were absolutely unmarked. And this was in direct contrast to the disfigurement of both men and women in England and in Europe. And she asks why, and they tell her that this curious thing called inoculation had been practiced over many generations, usually by elderly Greek women inside the Ottoman Empire. There was resistance to it among the Islamic Muslim population, although there were plenty of Muslims who, in other areas, not in Turkey itself, but in North Africa and in Syria, who absolutely accepted inoculation. It was a folk practice among them. But in sort of metropolitan Turkey, the imams were against it for the reasons you can hear on Christian Talk Radio in America now. It's a violation of God's absolute right to arbitrate between who will live and who will die. She went ahead with it with her 6-year-old son when her husband, I think they talked about it, though you don't know from the documents, but what is true is that she waits for him to go to Edirne, to Adrianople, with the Sultan, and then she inoculates. She has one of these old Greek ladies come, recommended by a man called Emanuele Timoni, who was a dragoman, interpreter, and a physician, and a diplomat, and he found this elderly Greek inoculator, and there was an embassy surgeon, a Scotsman called Charles Maitland, who was there looking on and then actually completed the operation. He thought the old Greek lady was being too rough with the little boy, and the little boy was crying and so on. So she goes through with it, and the boy is fine. He has a light fever, he has just very few scabs, and they all drop off, and he's fine. So when she goes back to England, she inoculates her daughter, who's 3, and it's also a success. And she amazingly converts the Princess of Wales, Caroline of Ansbach, who becomes Queen Caroline II. And something then, she becomes a publicist for this very, very counter... And nobody knows about germ theory. Nobody knows there's no such thing as the immune system. Nobody knows that. Nobody knows what a bacteria is. The word virus, oddly enough, is used. So there are kind of all sorts of theories about how infections arise from the imbalance of humours. They may arise from rotting organic matter, both animal and vegetable. But they don't understand the absolute basics, really, of the way what pathogens are and how they work. But they go ahead with this nonetheless. When this is known, since she wants to be a public campaigner, because 1 in 6 people who contract smallpox die of it, and those who survive, as I say, are very, very badly damaged, she then becomes a target, especially as a woman and as a mother, and as a woman who'd done this in what in England is regarded as the decadent East, not even a Christian culture. And it's said, what kind of mother would want to inject poison into the body of their perfectly healthy child? Why would you ever do that, really? So you have this very early time, in the early 1700s, a rehearsal of much of the anti-vax rhetoric that, alas, is sort of still with us, actually.
Mm-hmm. And you maybe a little bit first on that rhetoric, and then delve more into the book. You have more pictures with you, so let's. But because in the last chapter of your book,
right,
you well, also earlier in the book, but more sort of a longer view is in taking the last chapter of the book. That in many ways this since we're talking on a culture of democracy, in many ways, this recent pandemic, where you, in the first chapter you describe how you're on the Hudson, this lovely return of nature because we could see the skies, and also I think during the COVID pandemic. But in the end, you described this whole idea that it was a big gift in many ways to populism and radicalism and anti-democratic sentiment.
Yeah. No, this is an incredibly troubling phenomenon. We now have 2 candidates for the presidency of the United States next year, neither of whom is Donald Trump, who are both essentially against mandated policies about vaccines and mask wearing and lockdowns. One is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who's running for the Republican nomination, and more, just as worryingly, Robert Kennedy Jr., Senator Robert Kennedy's son, who has been an anti-vaxxer, was one of the earliest proponents of the absolutely debunked theory that early childhood vaccination for mumps, measles, and tetanus, I think, was responsible for autism in children. This was based on one article which was subsequently, in 2012, which was almost immediately retracted and was just a disreputable piece of research. So Kennedy, however, has pushed this a long time, and he's, of course, against all COVID vaccines altogether and entirely in favour only of natural immunity. He's a candidate for the Democratic nomination. You think, oh, well, he stands no chance of being nominated. Not necessarily so. Biden has run, I'm biased, my son-in-law works for the administration, but Biden has run, really after the horrible, almost unforgivable calamity of the evacuation from Afghanistan, he's run a very successful administration. But he has trouble with consonants, and he falls over, as we saw just the other day. So there's absolutely, what I know to be true, from a friend of mine who's the New York Times correspondent in London, is that money and, of course, the inevitable celebrity crackpot endorsements, Susan Sarandon at the top of the list, has already flowing Robert Kennedy's way. So this is really... and DeSantis and Kennedy, the Republicans have been delighted that Robert Kennedy is running because it will divide Democratic vote and so on. And the argument is the same on both sides, and the hard right and whatever we call Kennedy's side of the Democrats is, namely that individual liberties, the sovereign autonomy over one's own body was essentially illegitimately
violated.
Thank you. Illegitimately violated by all the measures that had to be imposed during the COVID pandemic. And so libertarianism, exactly as you say, Yuri, has found a way to weaponize retrospective resentments about that, which were dominant during the actual pandemic. I mean, there were 5 hard-right radio talk show presenters who absolutely refused to obey the principle about not going to crowded gatherings, and all 5 died of COVID in hospital. So the dilemma for those of us who are not anti-vaxxers, and for the author of this book, is that knowledge is not democratic, really. Knowledge can sustain democracy, but you have to believe in the inequality of those who possess knowledge and those who are ignorant or, merely superstitious, or addicted to preposterous conspiracy theories. There is not... So in some sense, actually, you want, in some circumstances, knowledge to be undemocratically sovereign, rather than your God-given rights to do whatever you... I mean, you have God-given rights to do whatever you want with your body, but in the case of a pandemic, your vulnerability to infection is obviously, contagiously, a danger to the entire community. Libertarianism founders on the obvious principle first elucidated, well, not first elucidated, but certainly elucidated by John Locke and countless others afterwards, that in order, even Thomas Hobbes, not famous for his liberalism, that in order to protect our common safety, we yield some of our primitive individualist freedoms in the interest of security. So we do not go through red traffic lights. We do put on our seatbelt on an aeroplane. There are all sorts of small ways in which we respect the contract to yield up some of our absolute liberty for the common good. And an extreme epidemic emergency, it ought to be one of those, and warranted by what science knows. But the web has been, the internet and the web has been extraordinarily dangerous for the authority of knowledge, really.
That's because we ended up with a large part of the population distrusting science, which is sort of the Enlightenment nightmare.
It's exactly the Enlightenment nightmare. I mean, I was saying this last night, when I was at school, one of my history teachers was a man called Robert Irving Smith. He was really a wonderful teacher. And we did the Enlightenment with him, which was helped by the fact that he looked exactly like Voltaire. He like the Houdon bust of Voltaire, complete with the pointy chin and the smile. And he said to us, well, we don't know what the rest of the 20th century holds. This would have been in 1957 or something. But we do know that two things are a thing of the past: organized religion and the nationalist state, so much for the prophetic powers of history teachers. But his vision was one we all shared, that when, the Enlightenment utopia of completely distributed knowledge would be realized, ignorance, poverty, and sickness would all eventually disappear. Yeah. And you would yield to what you empirically knew, to the Francis Bacon project, really.
Yeah, the project of modernity.
Yeah, exactly, the project of modernity, or as you say. What we didn't know, and we've come bloodily to understand, is that really modernity and instinct, modernity did not supplant instinct. These are the kind of terrible twins of advancing into the 19th and 20th century, and they've never been separated. And modernity, some aspects of modernity have actually, in some sense, meant the germination of madness, hysteria, paranoia, conspiracy theories, devotion to gut instinct, to the heart rather than the head. The Romantics have some responsibility for this, not all the responsibility, and that's where we are. I mean, as I've said, on the one hand, were creatures Enlightenment people who can produce a vaccine in record time. On the other hand, were also, were primitive people who are open to all this irrationality, a kind of superior knowledge which comes from God, comes from revelation, and the web has kind of equalized harder knowledge and intuitive illumination, and that is fucking dangerous.
Was it?
You may quote me.
Was that? Because now we started a little bit at the end of the book. I did it on purpose, of course, because we're in this dire straits at the moment, where science being mistrusted, influential politicians actually openly going for counterintuitive.
I'll just add this theory. I'll just add to it. What is really, when Trump says something like that, although Trump has never come out against vaccines, but he did come out with support for ridiculously unproven, ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. But he hasn't actually come out against vaccines. But the most infuriating and unforgivable things is that all these young Republican senators who went to Ivy League schools, like Joshua Hawley in Missouri, for example, they are prepared to weaponize, make people feel good about instinct and gut feeling. And this is unbelievably cynical. And Ron DeSantis, cynical and irresponsible and dangerous. And that is really unforgivable, I think.
Here in Holland and in other parts of Europe, the vaccine deniers have come suddenly out in favor of Putin. very vehemently.
Yeah, why is that? I mean, it does seem to be a package, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene and yeah, that is very weird. And since, you know, Putin's whole notion of the justification of what he's doing has been some very ill-digested, mystical, and often absolutely transparently false notion that there's no such thing as Ukraine and it's always part of Mother Russia and so on, and
very empirical.
And there's not really a separate language and all of that. So this too comes out of some, you know, mystical act of possession, which is really weird in an ex-KGB officer, I think, actually, but horrible and dangerous nonetheless. Yeah.
So let's go back to the beginning of the book and maybe delve a bit more in the narrative of it. But was one of the reasons to write this, was this sort of your hunch that a pandemic will cause trouble by...
No, it wasn't at all. It was I was writing a book. My publishers all expected me to deliver a completely different book called Return of the Tribes, which I started to write, and which was really about the culture of nationalism. So actually not totally unrelated to what we've just been talking about, but it was really about music, 19th century music, and the way music by composers like Glinka and Sibelius and so on, and it was about a little bit about landscape painting. It was about the distortion of history. A lot of it, the beginning was all about Kosovo and Milosevic and
Imagine communities and those.
Yes,
sort
exactly,
of things. Yeah.
exactly. And so I began to get very depressed about, you know, how tribal nationalism had really returned. So I thought the opposite from what you're correctly suggesting, that, well, when the pandemic hit, that this would be one moment where national self-interest, even in self-interest, nationalism would have to yield to a kind of global collaboration, whether under the auspices of the WHO or not, for the procurement of vaccines and the distribution of vaccines, should they be made. They're not yet been made, because, as Ghebreyesus, the head of the WHO, said, no one is safe until everybody is safe. An exaggeration, but, you know, viruses are no respecters of frontiers. So, of course, how preposterously naive I was to imagine any such thing. Rich countries leapt to procure massive advances of vaccines, far more than they could possibly use. So it didn't happen like that. So more depression. And I thought, well, I knew the WHO was the first specialized agency to be created by the United Nations in 1948, when it was founded in San Francisco. And that's indeed the case. So I went to the WHO archive online. We were all trapped, thank goodness, there for the web. And I discovered something, and it was a very good learned book, really, a monograph that had been published by the WHO, and in about 5 copies, so far as I can see. But it was called The Scientific Background to something called very appealing title, the International Sanitary Conferences, which had started in 1851 to fight cholera. And on the supposition that you would never deal with cholera, which was the great 19th century killer, simply in the place where it arose, that cholera was, even though you didn't get it by 2 people being in a room together and breathing at each other, you could indeed get it by shaking hands with someone whose hands were even faintly soiled. And so those who believed that cholera was indeed contagious needed to establish some pan-European, in the first place, policy of agreed quarantines, essentially. And the mover and shaker of this turned out to be him, who was Marcel Proust's father, Adrien, Dr. Proust. And I knew a little bit about Adrien Proust. Here he is in Venice.
From the Samarco.
It's after the end of the Sanitary Conference in 1893, where Proust is the first person to say there should be a permanent international public health body, which ends up much later being the WHO. And he turned out to be, I thought of him as just a sort of rather pompous figure of fun, and amused by the fact that he's the father to the greatest hypochondriac literary genius really ever. I mean, Marcel Duz is asthmatic, but, you know. And he was not a ridiculous figure. He was a figure of enormous dynamism, but very analytically minded, Adrien. And I'd sort of forgotten about him. Can we have the next slide? Until I remembered that many years ago I bought this little, it's a pamphlet almost, from a bouquiniste, I think near the Quai Voltaire in Paris, called Le Docteur Proust. And it was an éloge, it was a tribute on the 20th anniversary of Adrien Proust's death. He died in 1903 as the greatest figure in public health in France. And
put it in?
No, I didn't at all. No, it was just there.
Yeah.
It had been owned by an English person who'd inscribed his name in the front of the book. And he'd obviously put the sprig of hawthorn.
And he put a little bit of hawthorn in it.
Hawthorn, in it, yeah. So I thought, whoa, you know, which is sort of silly fantasy, but, you know, one's creativity is often governed by silly fantasies, or fantasies anyway. So I thought, I then subsequently, quite quickly, discovered that Proust was quite elderly gentleman. So 4 years after that photo of him in Venice, he'd spent a lot of his life going to the hotspots of cholera. I mean, where nobody really wanted to go. The hottest of hotspots was the border north of the Caspian Sea between Russia and Iran and Persia. That was really almost a kind of boiling pot of infection. And Proust wanted to prove what the roots of contagion were in Central Asia and from Central Asia through Russia to the rest of Europe.
Himself.
He went there and he journeys by camel and mule and horse, and he ends up trying to persuade the Shah of Persia at that time to establish an epidemiological institute in Tehran. Mm-hmm. There'd been one, the French succeeded in having one in Constantinople. It doesn't kind of work. And also to suspend the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which was an extremely dangerous way. Good luck with that. So it didn't happen. But he ends up in Bombay, as it then was, in Mumbai, at the beginning of the return of the 5th pandemic of bubonic plague. This is a photograph taken by the British of a burning gut, a funeral pyre cemetery. People were dying by their thousands every single day. The bubonic plague pandemic we've mostly forgotten about, killed 20 million people between its return in China in 1892 and before it was dealt with by by antibiotics, particularly streptomycin.
20 million?
Yeah.
In the sort of the turn of the century, sort of.
Yeah, between 1892
this is not the Black Death.
and the 1920s.
This is just the same thing, just recent. Yeah.
It's true. No, I mean, so in fact, COVID is worse because they killed so many more people in such a short time. But it was very startling, and it was particularly startling to empires like the British Empire, which essentially the official version justifying the British Empire in India was, we're not interested in giving you political rights. In the 1880s was the beginning of the nationalist movement in India, because the only people who really want political rights, the right to vote and so on, are overeducated journalists, people like you and me, are journalists, teachers, writers, and so on. The vast masses of people just want to have their material and physical life improved. Except, well, you know, okay, but people in India were dying in their millions of a succession of famines, and then they were dying in their millions for which the British were unable to protect them. From the plague. Can I read a little bit, which is what I call the... I mean, the issue for the British is that, but also it comes out in this little passage, which I hope you'll forgive me for reading, that the British are very eager to say we are a modernizing force in decadent Asia, in sleepy, somnolent, primitive Asia. But the very forms of modernization, particularly the shortening of steamship routes, railway trains, and so on, this is just about the time germ theory is finally revealed by Louis Pasteur and by Robert Koch in Berlin, enabled pathogens to jump ship, you know, to be aboard your shortened communications. The imperial bond turned out to be the imperial bind. The difficulty was this: the moustaches in the colonial office, the India office and the Viceroy's house in Calcutta, the brigadiers general in their cantonments, the tea planters in their vast gardens, they were called the tea plantations, peering at rows of toiling coolies, the magistrates enthroned beneath courthouse portraits of Kaiser-i-Hind Victoria wearing her face of unrisen dough, the customs inspectors of the canton godowns prodding the chests and bales, the chiefs of police, I see you, you don't see me, peaked caps pulled down over their eyes, their subordinates with their boiled cheeks and swagger sticks tucked under their arms, the hatted memsahibs tending herbaceous borders in gabled Uti and half-timbered Simla, or bending over the bowling greens, all those morning bright schoolmasters declaiming Shakespeare, the quality of mercy is not strained, while the punkah fans rose and fell on downcast ranks of boys, the polo riders nursing along G&T as they ha-ha-ho-hoed in the club, all believed, or at any rate said they believed, in the disinterested mutuality of their rule, the ultimate benevolence of their authority. They conceded to be sure that the empire had been made in their interest. Of course, what bloody fool or bloody hypocrite would deny it? But they all believed, or at any rate said they believed, what was good for the white rulers, their commerce, their laws, their troops, was self-evidently good for the ruled as well. P&O, the steamship company, lifted all ships, did it not? Was there not an Indian munshi standing to attention by the Queen's bedchamber's door? Funds banked in Glasgow and Liverpool, London and Birmingham found their way back east as investment. Well then, the toiling cultivator, the rickshaw runner, the ticket inspector in his starched khaki and filthily belted shorts, the driver of buffalo, the cutter of jute, and the logger of teak would, sooner or later, all be beneficiaries of this stupendous system of interlocking parts, the globally unparalleled distributor of peace and prosperity, the guarantor of shared well-being. Think of it this way, they did. The empire was an invitation to become modern. Why would anyone of any colour or confession decline that? So, something as inconveniently medieval as the Black Death had a cheek showing up at the very places which were busy being modern. Canton, Hong Kong, Singapore, Bombay, especially when everyone was so looking forward to celebrating the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. What a way to spoil a party. Still, it gave one pause. There were out there, undeniably, the starving, the sick, bags of bones blackening or bleaching in the roasting sun, heaps of them rotting on fields of battle, but never sought, of course, by the imperial masters, but never shrunk from either, crumpled up or kicked by cattle, lying in fields and roads, dumped in rivers and woods in years of catastrophic famine. And then when, as just had happened, plague came calling, ferried from the hospital boat anchored in the harbour to a remote mass grave, or carried to the ghats, the pyres, burning day and night, giving off the sickly smoke that collected as a dark mantle hanging above the town. So, you have this really profound paradox that what's supposed to make you new again is at the same time, creating an opportunity for infection. And our own experience with airlines, is exactly that.
Exactly the same.
Yeah.
100 years, a little bit over 100 years later. Yeah.
And then when you have to stop everything, so people aren't dying in quite that numbers, or you need to buy time to get a vaccine, that's exactly what my hero Hafkin did. People become extremely angry, and their regular lives just fall apart totally. And the anger remains, or it can be weaponized by unscrupulous politicians, which is where we are now.
And then you describe, which is sort of very troubling to read, because, and that's a well-known story, of course, but when the Black Death came to the northern parts of Europe, all the Jewish inhabitants of the smaller towns in the Rhine Valley were put, on the pile and burned and those sort of things. And you describe...
Not quite right. The professor and me. No, the massacre of the Jews in the Rhineland happened at the time of the First Crusade in the late 11th century.
But
in Italy, Jews were accused of poisoning wells,
the wells,
and there were riots. So there wasn't. They were being burned, but it was converts who were accused of not being true Christian converts. But your point is absolutely right, Yuri, that Jews were automatically. The reason is, again, which is why we have an interesting Jew at the heart of this book. I think.
I'm trying to get to
Yes,
him.
no, thank you. Churlish of me to distract you. But Jews were valued even by those who hated them, because they were held to be, like Moses Maimonides, possessor of esoteric medical wisdom.
Yeah.
And so Jews were very often extraordinarily hired by courts as makers of antidotes to poison. I mean, in Renaissance duchies and principalities, you turned round and someone was trying to put, some Borgia or other had put something horrible in your wine. Yeah, exactly, or in your venison tart. You know, so Jews were thought to have the secret antidote. I'm not sure they exclusively did, but they were constantly hired. The physician, who was a Marano Jew to Queen Elizabeth I, was suddenly accused of trying to assassinate her by poison and was indeed executed in England as a result. So, him, this is the Jew became interesting to me. And he's called Valdemar Mordechai Wolf Hafkin. And this photograph is itself an interesting image, I think. It's taken by a woman photographer called Angelina Ackland, who's the daughter of the Emeritus Professor of Pathology, Regius Professor of Pathology at Oxford, Sir Henry Ackland, in 1899, at the height of his short-lived fame. And in all sorts of respects, Hafkin came to England in 1899 as the golden boy who developed not one but two vaccines, one against cholera, which was thought to be impossible, but it's pretty much the basis before messenger RNA vaccines of anti-cholera. Anybody been vaccinated against cholera? I have. It hurts, but it works. And also, more importantly, a vaccine against bubonic plague, which the chances of dying from bubonic plague if you're unvaccinated were roughly 80%. If you had the vaccine, the chances of getting it, but more particularly of dying from it, were radically reduced. And so Hafkin was an extraordinarily interesting figure. He was very much in this manner of photography regarded as the good Jew, like Daniel Deronda. There were Lord Lister took him out, Florence Nightingale loved him, and so on. So he was a kind of, you know, there were Philo-Semites and plenty of anti-Semites in Britain around that time. It helped that, of course, being the good Jew, he was not only a doctor but played both the piano and the violin, one need hardly say, and was called on to perform at a country house in Devon for that. But Hafkin, come here, the next slide, was an incredibly interesting past. He was an Odessa Jew, brought up in a liberal family, no Yiddish spoken, spoke Russian and Hebrew when they went to synagogue, which was not all that often. His maternal grandfather was an Orthodox Jew. He attended as a math student and physics student, the only university you could attend in Russia if you were Jewish, the Novorussia University in Odessa. And in Odessa, he became extremely radicalized. He was one of a group of students who were the first to arm the Jewish community against the pogroms of 1881. They were an extraordinary young group. And he was caught with a gun 3 times and thrown into prison, from which, amazingly, he was rescued by his doctor father, a man called Eli Mechnikov, who was from a converted Jewish family, and who was the first person to demonstrate how the immune system worked, won the Nobel Prize for it. Mechnikov had, even as a huge police dossier was being formed on young Hafkin, Mechnikov had connections in St. Petersburg and sprung Valdemar from prison on condition that he stop being in politics, which he more or less did. When Mechnikov goes to Paris in the first year of the existence of the Institut Pasteur at the end of 1888, he brings Hafkeen with him, partly to keep him out of trouble, I think, but also because he detected in Hafkeen the makings of a serious and very, very clever microbiologist. Hafkeen can't, all the places are kind of full. Hafkeen has a very badly paid job as an assistant librarian, but at nights, he's doing his research at nights. He becomes the préparateur for the world's first course in microbiology. It's extraordinary. His notebooks are just full, obsessively, of incredibly complicated preparatory instructions to himself and to the students. It's an amazing thing to look at. My wife is a scientist, so I photocopied some of these things. They're in Hafkeen's personal archive in Jerusalem. And she said they're sort of amazing, even by standards of modern microbiological teaching. And he decides that he will try and do what was thought impossible, to develop a vaccine against cholera. And after 2 years of very disappointing results and incredible perseverance, he succeeds. And it presupposed two kinds of vaccine. Pasteur had already demonstrated the usefulness of that. You need to kickstart your immune system to recognize infections, so that the brand new illumination that your white blood cells, phagocytes, would start to engulf the invading pathogens. So you needed for that to happen, but it couldn't happen so strongly as to really damage you terribly. So Hafkeen developed a two-dose treatment in which you had a so-called attenuated dose of cholera, and that kick-started the system enough to prepare you for the intensive dose, which happened a week later. He tries it out on himself first, always, and then rounds up a lot of his Russian friends in Paris, who, being good eggs, decided, what the hell, nobody falls ill, it works, it's an extraordinary thing. But cholera, this is in 1892, he's in his early 30s, he gives these incredible revelatory papers to the Paris School of Biological Sciences, sort of a hero. He goes to England and is celebrated there. But cholera is receding, not completely. It's still a bad outbreak in Hamburg, but it's mostly receding. And Hafkeen does something else which now seems to us completely self-evident, but really wasn't. You needed randomized comparative trials to test, this is what all the pharmaceutical companies do, for safety and efficacy. In other words, needed all of you here, I'm presuming you look all pretty damn middle class to me, I have to say. So I'm going to say you come from relatively similar backgrounds, and you will have a vaccine and you won't, and you will have a vaccine and you won't. And we then exactly compare. So it was impossible to do in France, or indeed it could have been done in Russia, which was one of the vulnerable countries. But as it happens, at that moment, it's like a kind of wild sort of Tom Stoppard play. The British ambassador in Paris was a man called Viscount Dufferin, who'd been the British ambassador, who'd been the Viceroy of India. And his wife, Harriet, who was a remarkable woman, another crucial woman, had started the education of Indian women to be doctors in India, so had an interest in epidemics. And Dufferin suggested Hafkeen, thank you. Why? Where is Caroline? You're reading my... Wow, I'm not even married to you, and you know exactly what I'm going to do. This is positively sinister. Anyway, or benevolently sinister, if that's not an oxymoron. So he goes out to India expecting to be supported in the work of cholera vaccination, but the British India medical establishment don't like him. He's Jewish, he's Russian, the Russians are up there somewhere in the northwest provinces. He's not a doctor, he has no medical degree. He has the best possible science doctorate you could ever imagine, loads of publications, created a vaccine no one thought could be made safely, but he's not a doctor. And they're obsessed with so-called disinfection campaigns. In other words, it's quite true, you do need to disinfect fecally contaminated areas to prevent cholera from spreading, but they were not interested in the pathogenic science, the microbiology at all. So Hafkeen's not given support. He's not given money. He's not given a laboratory, except one place, an English friend of his, who was one of the early volunteers in Paris, had been made a medical officer in Agra, and he gave him a little space and a little money. And Hafkeen then embarks on this extraordinary campaign of cholera vaccination. This is, I mean, I don't know what my art history friends here, this reminds me, if not of the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, then of a kind of, you know, the calling of Matthew or something, like Caravaggio. It's so baroquely composed. There is our hero, who's always dressed. He's one of his few, and I'm a fine one to say, but one of his few failings. He's a tremendous dandy. I read his account books and knew that he was obsessed with two things. He needed a good supply of safe vaccines, three things. He needed grain for the laboratory animals back in Calcutta, and he needed black silk socks or whatever. He went thousands of miles on vaccination camp. This is in 1894 and 1895. And instead of simply vaccinating the people the British were interested in having vaccinated, namely native troops, Indian troops, he vaccinated the poorest of the poor. This is actually not a village, it's a busti, which were the slightly semi-rural little plots in Greater Calcutta in which very poor migrant labourers lived and worked. And here he is, and you can see with one of his only supporters, a man called William Simpson, who was one of the Calcutta medical officers behind him. But the Indian figures there are doctors who he's trained in both the theory and practice of vaccination and microbiology. And we know one's called Mr. Dutt and the other one's called Mr. Marendra. And we know about them. I have a pretty shrewd idea of exactly which district of Calcutta he's working in when this photo was taken, but I can't quite prove it. I think it's a place called Katal Bagan. But the photographers, you can see, they don't edit this really. There are these fearful children and slightly angry woman in the front, and there's a sense in which this whole operation is for very ordinary people, and that's something which goes through the whole story of his career when he develops the plague vaccine as well. So it's extremely moving to me.
But he got blamed, of course. For...
He has an unhappy ending. Yeah. Can we just have the next one to show you again? There's a photograph of him doing a street vaccine. This time against the plague in Bombay and Mumbai this time. There he is, actually, even though you can't see his face, that is him. I know it because it's identified in the print in Jerusalem. Interestingly, and these are all volunteers, vaccination was never coercive at all for by anyone, particularly Hafkeen. So can you see there's a kind of umbrella, parasol. Underneath it is a woman. Next slide, and we know who she is. She's called Alice Courthorne, and you can just see, sorry the slide's not very good, here's Alice who vaccinates 1,000 people a day in one of the most plague-infected towns in the Carnatic in her mobile vaccine buggy. So all encouraged extraordinarily by Hafkeen and trained. And the next, finally, after the chief enforcement of disinfectant policy. Can we have the one which has the incubation bottles, Caroline? He's finally given a space in the old government house in Mumbai, and this is a photograph of the incubation room where the bottles of anti-plague vaccine are being prepared. It's the first mass production vaccine facility in the world. Starts in 1899. 2 million doses are produced in 3 years, not just for all over India, but they're exported to Africa and Malaya and Singapore and China and even as far away as Australia, which was briefly touched by plague. And then, as Yuri said, in 1902, something dreadful happens. In a small village in the Punjab called Malkawal, 19 people die of tetanus poisoning from a contaminated batch. And Hafkeen himself, to whom the Anglo-Indian establishment never quite warmed, immediately gets the blame. The Viceroy, Lord Curzon, said Hafkeen should be tried and hanged, basically for bringing the authority of the British Empire to care for its citizens into disrepute. Hafkin knows that the problem, the contamination, must have happened in the village, not at his facility, for the following reason, that it took 2 weeks or so to get from, in very careful conditions, to get the vaccine safely to, as it happened, to the particular village in the Punjab where the accident happens. And if the tetanus had begun to grow in Parel, in Bombay, it would have given off an extremely strong odour, a horrible smell, which as soon as the stopper had been removed would have blown your head back, and nobody in the vaccination team reported. So that told him that the vaccinations in these villages happened in open fields. Subsequently, what was discovered was that the man preparing the syringe had dropped the forceps which were used to remove the bottle stopper with its Indian rubber rim. The forceps had dropped on the ground. He'd picked them up and he'd disinfected them by sluicing them in carbolic acid. Hafkin's instruction in the little book of instructions for preparers said, always use heat. That was the French Pasteur way. Carbolic acid will not work as well and it will not work speedily. You must pass anything that might have been contaminated through the high flame of spirit. That had not happened. So he's fired after commissions of inquiry. His career is broken. He goes to London to try and plead his case. It doesn't really work until another extraordinary scientist and the man you saw, the white guy in the background of the cholera vaccination, William Simpson, who also believes Hafkin is completely innocent in this. The scientist who takes up his case, I mean, it's very like, you know, a medical Dreyfus case in a way. It's called Ronald Ross, who established the connection between Anopheles mosquitoes and malaria. And he really instinctively knows some miscarriage of justice had been done. And after an incredibly intensive, you know, fierce campaign in the newspapers and the medical journals, Hafkin is completely vindicated. But his scientific life is over. It's sort of broken. And there's an apology in Parliament, sort of a mealy-mouthed British-style apology. That's not really an apology. Sort of some unfortunate misconstruction of the evidence, you know, that'll happen, awful. And Hafkin gets a job back in India, but he's kept away from vaccine production completely. Is given a little space in the grounds of Calcutta General Hospital.
In a way, he is the embodiment of your title, isn't it? Foreign body.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I think of.
And him being Jewish, coming from Odessa.
Yeah.
You also point to a sort of irony, bitter irony of the fact that Jews being accused of being the carriers of diseases.
It was a standard trope of fascism and of the Nazis.
And also then, and also later in the 20th century, and also now. I mean, it's still being said about George Soros or things like that. So
yes, exactly.
So it's a bitter irony, of course, that not only him, not only Hafkin, but also others who are at the sort of the beginning of the whole scientific trust to understand, you know, what actually.
Some of the same thing came back to haunt Jonas Salk, who's also accused at the time of the polio vaccine. So it's a syndrome that often repeats itself. Fauci, not Jewish, Anthony Fauci, but he's also being, you know, hounded in Congress. They want to start criminal prosecution against him because he's somehow part of, quote, the elite. He's someone, Fauci, Italian name, somehow someone who, you know, has sort of imposed his vision, really.
You can actually read that he's being called a Jew. If you carefully look at the internet.
Is that right?
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's anti-Semitic tropes against him, though he's not being Jewish. He's just small.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Which doesn't make you especially Jewish, but would you? Because now we're back at Fauci through sort of the life of Hafkin. This part of the book where you point at the sort of the really horrible idea that though we thought that we might enlighten, everybody if science and enlightenment just reach all the deeper parts of society, we will be able to have a balanced democratic process. But the opposite seems to be true.
Well, I don't think
our Prime Minister...
I don't think populist belief should be confused with representative democracy, really. And it's interesting, actually. What's been very nice, and has been said today by one of your colleagues here, is that, and she was comparing it with my good friend Peter Frankopan's very dark ending to his wonderful book On the Earth Transformed, which is very ominous and if edges on the apocalyptic. And someone said, well, I thought your book was more, there was more hope and more optimism.
Yeah.
And that is true of my general attitude to life, and I explain it by the fact of having grandchildren, although who you want to have a future for. But I think I've always been a glass half full person. No, I don't think necessarily the kind of sovereignty of stupidity is necessarily going to prevail. But I think we are in a fight, a fight made harder by the fact that the internet legitimates idiotic opinion, which is just opinion. God told me, or, QAnon told me this, that, and the other. And that creates, for the people who believe this stuff, believe Robert Kennedy Jr., the same authority as people who've spent 20, 30, or just 5 years actually working as virologists or scientists in the hard graft of earned knowledge. But it's a fight. It's not, we haven't lost that fight. It's just that we have to know we're in a fight. And the difficulty is wonderful scientists like Sarah Gilbert and, again, foreign bodies, the two brilliant Turkish immigrants who came up with the messenger RNA vaccine. And in fact, actually... And
had been accused now of enriching themselves and being immigrants.
All those accusations.
All those,
It's very interesting that actually Ronald Ross said to Hafkin, why didn't you create a patent for the plague vaccine? And Hafkin said, it never crossed my mind to do so. I mean, he was childish, I suppose. But again, the idea of actually profiting from... Ross himself felt hard done by the fact that his discovery about the transmission of malaria had somehow he'd not reaped the commercial benefit of that.
But that's not a detail, of course, because you described this, that they didn't gain from it in a... they didn't make money out of it.
No,
actually, he was his own guinea pig first, which is very important, I think, a very important passage, where he is not going out to... I mean, he could easily find probably people in India, to test on, in the most horrible way. But he didn't. But
he does it in a public demonstration in order to say, and he has all his helpers. He can't be everywhere. They all vaccinate themselves first.
Exactly. And it didn't even cross his mind to make a patent out of it, though you could have done. But
he is very unworldly, and I don't want to make him too saintly. I really don't. But,
the pharmaceuticals now, of course, and there's a big difference.
Well, I think the pharmaceuticals are what they are. Pfizer and the rest of them, and of course that plays again into the hands of populist campaigners who say the Jews, the corporations, they're all in cahoots with each other, and I mean it's extraordinary. The part of the DeSantis line. In his campaign just started is that all these people have robbed you of your freedom, robbed you of your God-given American right to you decide whether you're going to stay at home or test yourself or anything like that, in order, one, to make a huge amount of money, and two, again, to sort of enslave you to the deep state, and that's why they've done this. So, in some sense, the fact of profiting from these things has sort of been, again, a gift to populist politics. Which is another reason, really, why you would hope for, in my utopian way, that there could be a much more genuinely, globally democratic way of distributing vaccines. I mean, for example, there are some manufacturers including some in Asia, I think, not China, but in India, who did not take a patent, actually, again, during the COVID vaccine. And so that it could be available. Well, the idea of not taking an exclusive patent was that a messenger RNA or the older form of creating vaccines, the Hafkeen way, could be manufactured in South Africa, for example, in tropical Africa. And some of the bigger pharmaceutical companies said, no, if we do that, then we can't put investment back into developing a vaccine for the next pathogen that's come around the corner. Well, you have to not entirely dismiss that, but you also don't have to agree with it. I mean, it was very important that patents would be waived in the case of countries that desperately needed, both for speed and cheapness, to generate vaccines for. And that sort of remains very much in the balance. The scientists, bless them, they're too busy and too absolutely committed to write campaigns of persuasion. And I'm just sort of an amateur at all this. And I suppose, Yuri, the reason why I felt I was glad I wrote it, I don't pretend, you even though you're not going to persuade somebody who really thinks that George Soros or Bill Gates or something is inserting a microchip, but there are there's the vast middle, really, who you do try and want to persuade with writing that everybody can read and that isn't just a learned article in the British Medical Journal or Nature or Science, really. So
one of the many ironies of this topic is that a lot of the anti-vax people actually put on Jewish stars.
Yeah, that is horrible. That's a whole different and vile story, as the kind of the Shoah of convenience, is absolutely horrific. Precisely because what they've done is actually to take something which is designed to save millions of lives and equate it with something which took millions of lives. So you don't get... I mean, being that stupid is not an excuse for being that wicked.
Sometimes being stupid is a sin.
Yeah, or a crime.
Yeah, a crime. Yeah.
Right.
There's much more to say about it.
Surely
much more. It's a wonderful book, and it's a very timely book. And but first, we always promise that. First, I'd like to see whether there's anybody who have any questions or remarks or, to put to. There's a woman over there and there's a gentleman over here. I come to you because there's viewers at home, and there might be many, many more viewers at home later on while we put it on the internet. So, okay. Yes, I'd keep it for you.
Okay, thank you. Well, my name is Henriette Ankone. Thank you for your talk this afternoon. I was just wondering, do you believe in nature? Like in the way that nature is perfect as it is. If we look outside at nature, if we see the seasons, if we see how things grow, how everything fits in a perfect way, do you feel grace looking at nature?
That's an interesting question. Actually, there's the whole introduction of the first.
I'm not quite sure I understand it. It's a bit like, do you believe in weather? But yeah.
I thought you asked, do you believe in nature? Don't you?
Well,
that's the first part of it. It's like.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Why
nope, one moment.
do you think we need so much medication?
Okay. Oh, I see.
Right.
I don't. Okay. Your real question is that natural immunity is enough. Is that what you're saying? Natural immunity following infection. Very simply, we don't have any idea how long natural immunity lasts. So no, I don't. I certainly don't believe that nature takes care of all maladies. In which case, millions of people would not have died of smallpox and cholera, and they did. Really, nature did not take care of them. In the case of smallpox inoculation, 1 in 6 people, nature killed 1 in 6 people. If you had an inoculation, your chances were 1 in 50. measurably, statistically measurable. So nature, but you know, the immune system is nature. I mean, actually taking the whole process of vaccination is a natural process, in that you're taking matter from an infected person in order to kickstart your immune system. What's unnatural about that? It's not a you're not talking about a chemically produced artificial entity. You're talking about an organic substance which you're using to help you avoid death. That's nature. That's why it's called the natural science. Okay? Good.
Yep.
Oh, thank you for this great talk. I think the way that you play off anti-vaxxers against science is a bit too absolute. Because I cringed when I ever heard Mark Rutte saying we're following the science, or even when Anthony Fauci came up with the science. Where was the science between September 2019 and the end of March 2020, when something might have been done? They were at odds with each other. We were treated in the Netherlands, the Jaap van Dissels telling us right through spring 2020 that masks didn't have any function and were even worse than not wearing them. And the science, the consensus of science at any given moment is bound to be wrong. It was wrong when Pasteur started his work. So it's a little, I think, too easy just to talk about science as being the antidote, something that we have to fight for against these anti-vaxxers.
Well, we disagree about that, but I don't think anybody who does support the findings of science would ever remotely say that scientists necessarily all agree. But you learn cumulatively from corrective knowledge and you know, things like randomized comparative trials. But you're ultimately dealing with instinctive beliefs against you know, data and empirical observation. So I would still.
Yeah, but I don't think it's an absolute.
One second, because otherwise.
I don't think it's an absolute distinction. I think it has to be posed more nuanced, with more nuance.
Well, as I said, Gary, I don't think anybody who essentially does support the science say the science is absolute. I mean, you know, but
they make that suggestion.
Okay, well, between, you know, let's say between ivermectin has been shown to be completely useless, really, and that's been, you know, that was promoted by talk shows and right-wing politicians as being something which would work just as well as vaccines, but it's statistically demonstrated to be completely useless, really. So you can't equate.
There was a great immunologist in the south of France who was propagating this, and he was the head of a scientific institution that was funded by the French government, and so it isn't that easy just to say science is going to provide the antidote.
Thank you very much for not agreeing, also, because it's wonderful to have a.
We've spent a lifetime not agreeing, actually, and still being.
And that makes it absolutely more interesting, because there's questions to be said and asked, and answers to be given. But there's other people who might want to join in. The gentleman over here with the glasses at the second row, and there's a man over there. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier the Governor DeSantis, as he wants to be called.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Over DeSantis and this trend in America that the vaccine is something invasive and something that we have to avoid.
Right.
But at the same time, reproductive rights are being taken away from women. How do they manage to do that at the same time? I find that quite interesting, actually. Do you have a reason why you think that they can have one without the other? Do you understand?
Yes, they do it through selective hypocrisy, essentially. But you're absolutely right, yeah.
The second row, yeah.
Thank you very much for that interesting conversation. If we ignore temporarily the disturbingly large proportion of people who are still anti-vaccines, would you believe by now that we have learned the lessons we should have learned from the past? Are we ready as a country or a continent for the next pandemic?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, the sun is shining out there. It's interesting in Britain, as you probably know, there's a COVID inquiry, and then this, which is being begun as to whether, what was done for the procurement of vaccines and also the measures taken. So the kind of debate about what public policy was vis-a-vis the pandemic is kind of rumbling on, but at a very, very low level. I think we have a remarkable capacity to really forget. I mean, there were letters in the, I'm trying to think of it, in the British press and the American press today saying, it was in the British press actually, that, that we've moved, this terrible, I hate this phrase, moved on from this whole thing, and that almost the sense in which something, it seems to me, a no-brainer, I wish I could say otherwise, that there is likely to be another serious pandemic around the corner. We all hope it's not H5N1, avian flu, which humans, there have been 38 cases of humans catching it, but no cases whatsoever of human-to-human transmission of avian flu. But if that was the case, we would be in terrible trouble. Would we be in a position to have a more coherent global policy about the distribution, manufacture and distribution of vaccines, about the waiving of patents? You really hope so. Certainly, if you want to go, if you want to put the World Health Organization on your timelines, I have every other day there is. But these are people speaking from the same page. They're talking to each other. So that's not a helpful answer to your question. I don't know, and the ease of oblivion and forgetfulness is terribly strong thing, actually. So I think it's different in places like which produce the AstraZeneca vaccine. I mean, I know there's a lot of work being done on the issue of whether or not avian flu could be transmissible by humans, and preparing for the worst outcome should that be. I think more of a danger, I'd say, is that in the United States, I'm sure probably not in this country, or maybe not in this country, I shouldn't presume, but in the United States, virology itself, the discipline, has been demonized as something that plays with fire. It is absolutely true that there are lab leaks. There's no question about that, and there are more than get publicized. Is it the case? I'm not the person to ask, really, but is it the case that COVID began as a lab leak rather than natural transmission? For me, still, as an absolutely lay reader of the scientific evidence that I can understand, the odds are still tremendously on the side of those who think it was naturally transmitted through originating in horseshoe bats, and then the intermediate host is likely to have been one of these animals that was caged up at the Huanan wholesale seafood market. Likely, and again, I'm nobody, don't take me as any kind of authority. My imposter syndrome anyway is huge, so in this case it be absolutely borders on the criminal. But the issue of it would be extremely dangerous and really a travesty of it's sensible to establish much more serious safety precautions in the manipulation of viruses in order to see what their transmissibility is. It would be stupid not to do that. The protocols should be much tighter than they are currently. On the other hand, it would be incredibly dangerous if this phrase gain of function, which presupposes creating a chimeric virus, a manipulated virus to see exactly if a mutation can be humanly transmissible, if that was suddenly outlawed, or virology itself. Virology as a discipline suddenly became something which was, too dangerous to pursue. I mean, the parallels, of course, with what the current debate about AI are extremely striking. But whatever one feels about a moratorium on AI, and I'm rather in favor of it the more I read, especially when you read things from the people who've created AI, I don't feel the same way about virology. I mean, we need to know what the next potentially extremely transmissible, dangerous pathogen is around the corner before it hits.
I have two questions. How do I pronounce your name correctly? And
Sorry, what?
How do I pronounce your name correctly?
My name?
Yeah.
Oh, it's Schama. Yeah.
Schama.
Yeah.
And what triggers you to
That's
write?
an easy one, you know.
What triggers you to write a new book? I understand with so much knowledge and experience. When do you decide, oh, I'm going to write about that?
Oh, I don't, you know, this is I'm ashamed to say, my 20th book, really. What a misspent life, you know. I don't know, there is no, it's a lovely question, but I don't have a timetable, you know, I don't feel, I also make a lot of television programs, which I enjoy, not just the making, but the editing and getting them out on the BBC. So I'm kept busy, but I don't really have a timetable. I think I've been lying to fallow. It is really the moment, you know, I described the way I was drawn to doing the kind of audacity of this kind of book from rather than doing something which I was more easy, you know. I mean, the nationalism project seemed to be something I already knew about. And I suppose this doesn't quite answer your question, but in the pandemic, I really wanted to go back to school in a way. I mean, again, having a scientist wife, I kept on saying to Ginny, you know, is this really outrageous? And she said, yes, but you have to do it anyway, you know. So I really wanted to, it's a matter of, I'm quite old now, I'm 78, and I guess I'm not interested in golf or you know, cruises, really. It's a question whether you want to kind of ease up and do what you know how to do, or whether you want to go back to school. I said this at a session in London about the book, and I said, you know, when you get old, you really do want to start learning again, I think. And a little 10-year-old boy who'd asked me about what it was like to learn a new subject said, "You're not that old." And a friend of mine said, "He's a plant, you know, really." And so I suppose it's that. So the kind of sense of panic that'll come a moment when I'm really too senile. I'm in what my old disreputable friend Gore Vidal called the springtime of senility, which I love, which is where I am. So when it gets to autumn of senility, I won't be able to do this kind of thing, you know.
There's a gentleman over here, I think, in the green. Ian Cantor.
Do you know when I have an interview?
Yeah, we're closing.
Yuri, not here. No. Oh, it is here. It is here. Sorry.
It is here.
Yes, yeah,
this is the last question, actually.
Yeah, okay.
It is the last question. Professor Schama, I've thoroughly enjoyed your talk and staggered by your memory, your use of language, your extraordinary ability to string words together, and your delivery.
Like a very old parrot.
Again. So my question is not related. It's kind of unrelated. Is your reference to Dutch and Dutch history and culture and Judaism purely a function of your own personal history, or is there more to it?
Wow. It's always the last questions which are the deepest. And, I suppose a bit of both. I mean, again, it's just to recite a set of cliches, but there being cliches doesn't make them false. I do think the Dutch Republic was a kind of miracle, you know, for all slavery and empire and all the terrible things that were common to all European states. The ability to have, in some ways, a state, a republic made up of local communities which cared about, in their, you know, occasionally grim ways, cared about orphans, cared about old people, and so on, and had a sort of sense of being in a kind of having a shared interest that wasn't purely about power, not purely about power. And I'm not being starry-eyed. I still find in this, as I say, simple-minded way, possibly genuinely moving. So I suppose that's part of it, I think. I guess it's easiest to, again, a lot of 19th century writers, particularly French writers, especially French writers, like historian I feel quite close to, even though some of his views, and not to mention his writing, is strange. Gilles Michelet, who was great historian of the French Revolution, and indeed of the French Middle Ages, and the first great national archivist in France. Michelet came to Holland as soon as the railway train made it out to Amsterdam. And there were others, of course, famously Théophile Gautier and Théophile Thoré and so on. And they all saw in the Netherlands, even in the 19th century, and it was an illusion. I mean, it was a sort of totally imaginary ideal of a kind of peaceful republic, even when it was in the 19th century a monarchy. I don't think that vision, as childlike and visionary and imaginative, was altogether false. So I sound sort of shamelessly, as we say in Yiddish, schmoozing you all, really. But I tweeted this morning, when I just looked out at, admittedly, the Herrengracht from my little hotel room, and said, you look out of the window and you're instantly happy. And it's sort of pathetic, isn't it? But also not pathetic.
Thank you very much for that last question. It was a perfect question because it's also where we started this conversation. Yeah. So it was a full circle. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the answer, for being so nice to us Dutch. And also, there's so much unsaid about the book. I think just to close off, you're a wonderful inspiration. The way you tell stories. The way you intertwine history with art, with deep knowledge of art, of what you look at, what actually pictures mean, the way you describe the picture here of the scene where that man who's a little bit of a dandy, is vaccinating all those people around him and those poor people around him, what it tells you. And you're, in many ways, I would say, a wonderful inspiration, the way you treat history and tell stories to us, which are very well written. I just told you over lunch, but I've been reprimanded at the end of the 80s as a young student in Leiden for using one of your books, Landscape and Memory, in one of my papers, and being really picked out by the professor, and you told off that I shouldn't use, these sort of unscientific literature in my notes, and you have been an inspiration ever since.
It seems to have been. I guess I'm honoured. It's the ultimate backhand compliment, because I took somebody in Rotterdam last night, and what all graduate education in the 80s and 90s had in common in Holland was the crimes of Schama, really. The crimes and follies of Schama, really. So I apologise for getting you into trouble.
Please, Landscape and Memory is a wonderful book.
Thank you.
It's one of the many wonderful books. This is one as well, and I'm extremely grateful to you that you came here to talk to us about your new book. What struck me was that all history is natural history. You write as sort of a motto to the book, which is the same motto as Peter Frankopan used at the opening of our 4 days of talks on a culture of democracy.
Neither Peter nor I knew until about 6 months or ago that we were writing the books we were doing, even though we were friends. And it was very striking to both of us, actually.
Yeah, and it's such a wonderful coincidence, again, making it full circle, but also the return of the idea that we are part of the natural world.
Right.
And I think if Frankopan and you are writing about the same sort of topic, that we humans are not are part and parcel of the natural world, and that we need to realize that, and that the whole history of science in which bright people looked at those pathogens and the way we treat them, we can use them, or they're very dangerous at us. I think it's a wonderful book at a very terrible time. A wonderful book that's come to us. A very inspirational book again, because it's full of hope. I don't think it gives answers to whether we should use it this way or the future, or of pandemics, but it's absolutely necessary to read it to understand what's happening in periods when there's a pandemic around. And like you said, it's probably not the last one, alas. Right. So thank you very, very much for sharing this with us.
Thank you.